Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this PestFacts WA webinar. This webinar is being delivered as part of the DPIRD Seasonal Status of Pests and Diseases Delivered to Growers project, which is a GRDC co-investment. And just for your knowledge, the webinar is being recorded today. My name is Cindy Webster, and I'm the project lead, and I will be hosting the webinar today, and my colleague Jeanette Pratt will be co-hosting behind the scenes. DPIRD acknowledges the traditional custodians throughout WA and the continuing connection to the land, waters and community. We pay our respects to all members of the Aboriginal community and their cultures, and to elders both past and present. In today's webinar, we first have DPIRD Principal Research Scientist Ian Foster talking to us about WA's climate. DPIRD Senior Research Scientist Svetlana Micic will then be talking to us about spring and summer invertebrates. And then DPIRD Principal Research Scientist Geoff Thomas will be talking to us about spring diseases and preparing for next season. We will be having a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, so please use the Q&A tool or the chat to enter any questions or comments you may have for our presenters. And the webinar is being recorded and we'll be publishing this on the DPIRD YouTube channel afterwards. And I'll now hand over to Ian Foster for his presentation. Thank you, Ian.
Good, thanks, Cindy. Welcome all. The outline will be fairly simple, beginning with just a recap of the seasonal climate we're seeing this year to date. What's happening within the ocean outlooks, because that does have an influence on us, and how that's translating through into the seasonal outlook coming from the various climate models. So the three charts here show rainfall deciles. And decile, if you may or may not be familiar with this, is just a simple ranking system. And it means on these charts, if anywhere is blue, it was above average. Anywhere it's white, it was about average for the period. Anywhere red, you've guessed it, was below average. The chart on the left just shows the rainfall deciles for January to March. And you'll see, as far as, say, the cropping sector is concerned, you'll see the northern grain belt had a relatively dry that period. Most of the other areas were about normal, which doesn't necessarily mean a lot of rain, but there was a notable rain event just near Albany. Now, prior to that, there was rain over November and December throughout a lot of the southern rangelands. So I haven't shown that one just because that confuses things. So just as far as the start concerned, it was a relatively dry beginning, but there had been rain late in 2024. Moving on to April, May, June, which is sort of the start of the southern growing season, you see it was generally a pretty dry period across most of southern WA other than the Esperance region. So that was a dry start. For a lot of the cropping areas, it was a late start. The rain didn't really kick off until about June. Really big contrast to the last 3 months, which is across most of southern WA, a significant pickup in rainfall for these 3 months. So they've either been average or above average. And the early part of October had seen some continuing cloud band activity in a band from sort of the southern rangelands through tipping the edges of the ag region into the goldfields. So that's a big contrast between a relatively dry, delayed start, and it really kicked off from July onwards. Now, what that means in terms of translating to total seasonal rainfall, this is a chart that Meredith Guthrie has done for us. This is just total rainfall since the 1st of April. Now, the large areas here have recorded 200 to 300 millimetres of growing season rain, and even more towards the coast. The red area is slightly more expanded. They're still very close to 200 millimetres, so it doesn't mean that it's dry there at all. It's just a bit of an artefact of the smoothing. Now, what that means in translated to rainfall deciles, in this case, we've used the year since 1975 as a reference, using the bulk of the agriculture, both north and south, this overall period, when you put it all in a big bin and stir it up and add all the numbers up and look at the deciles, they were largely above average, with a large area here that was more or less average for the season, with an area around sort of Williams Narrogin that's been persistently drier than normal, but that still meant they were getting, say, 300 plus millimetres of rain. So even though it's relatively dry for them, it was still delivering a reasonable amount of rainfall. So that's where we've come from in that point. Now, what that's then meant in terms of the soil moisture. So this is from the Bureau of Meteorology. This is an estimated land surface root zone available soil moisture. So it's done on a 5 kilometre grid where they simulate soil moisture vegetation types. So you can see here's these. Now the bluer areas means there's more soil moisture for the time of year. So that's the lingering effects of the cloud band in early October. So it's clipped through bits of the eastern grain belt and the northern grain belt as well. But also that it came just before that. There was a couple of very hot, warm days, certainly for the north and for the south before that. And so we've seen now quite a noticeable drying of the available soil moisture. So the crops may look green, there's a large amount of biomass, but there's not necessarily a lot below the surface. So this shows, but there is still plenty of soil moisture in those far eastern districts, courtesy of that rain band. So stepping through, the other part that's been going on with the season is that in general, so this is just the seasonal temperature deciles. So it's the same sort of concept as with rainfall. These yellow areas just meant that as far as the maximum air temperatures, that is the daytime air temps, meant it was warmer than average for most of that season. So that would probably come as a little surprise. With the minimum temperatures, which is here, it was slightly warmer than average, with perhaps areas around the sort of central grain belt there being about average, which then means that there has been a series of frost events. So that has clipped a bit off yields in a few places, especially some areas such as Lake King. So those things have occurred. But overall, apart from being a relatively warmer season once things kicked off, we haven't seen a lot in terms of the number of extremes. And in some cases, in the recent weeks, people in the northern grain belt were commenting actually how until date, it's changing a bit now, but until date it had been relatively mild. So other stories about what we could see coming relate to what's happening within the oceans. And the two charts here, the one on the left shows a seasonal temperature anomaly, that is deviations from average from July until early October, courtesy of NOAA. So you'll see there's areas here in the eastern Indian Ocean, which is warmer than average, and off Africa, it's cooler than average or normal. That's the signature of a phenomenon called the Indian Ocean dipole, when it's in this negative, it's called a negative phase, when it's warmer here and cooler there. We're also starting to see the nascent signs of developing of a weak La Nina event in the Eastern Pacific, and the signature of that is this cooling along the equator. Other points to note, the general warmth of the Coral Sea and the Tasman Sea and lingering bits down the WA coast, which you can see in the expanded version from the Bureau of Meteorology. So we can see that's the signature of the Indian Ocean dipole, and there's a little bit of lingering heat down around the Northwest Shelf, and there's still warmth within the Coral and Tasman Seas. Now, the reason why this is important is that within the tropics, where you get that type of pattern, you get a concentration of weather systems that, sort of thunderstorms, convective systems, and those are the things that release moisture into the upper atmosphere that can be brought down to the south if you've got a weather system. And it's precisely that gave us the cloud band in early October. So these things are important because they represent a source of moisture. You still got to have weather systems come and extract it, but it says there's moisture sources there. There's an opposite phase of this where it gets cooler than average off Sumatra, and that tends to suppress rainfall over Australia. But we're in the pattern here where in general it'll be contributing to the potential, at least, for rainfall. Still got weather events have got to come to the party. Looking ahead, this is from the Bureau of Meteorology, their predicted sea surface temperature forecast for November to January. So they're expecting a continuation of the La Nina event. It's not particularly strong, so it's a relatively weak sort of a thing, but it is expected to crank up a bit. And you see the decay of the Indian Ocean dipole, which is a normal event when you get into summer. Other points of notice, expected continuing warmth off Eastern Australia and continuing warmth off the Pilbara coast. So that could potentially support tropical cyclone development, but it also is a threat to the Ningaloo Reef corals as well. So this is the sort of global picture that the climate models are looking at. So this is an example from the Bureau of Meteorology's website, where it's just looking at November rainfall, just based on conditions as of last week. So the chart on the left just shows for November the chances that the rainfall will exceed median. So it's just a simple two-category split. If it's the greeny colours, greeny darker blues, then there's a higher chance that that's going to happen. If it's the muted colours, the whitey greys, doesn't matter. It's about neutral, meaning the model has no preference for one way or the other. So you might look at that and think for southern WA, oh, rain is coming. But the chart on the right, it's from the Bureau of Met, where you can drill in, and this just shows what the median rainfall from those runs looks like. And so for the northern ag region, for example, you're looking at less than 10 millimetres for the whole month. So that'll be evaporated in 2 days, should it happen. And for a lot of these areas, the yellow is 10 to 25 millimetres. That's not a lot of rain, given that the evaporation rates are going up. So whatever rain's happening is likely to be more south coastal, which is a typical climatological pattern at this time of year. So yes, November might be a tiny bit wetter, but don't bank on it much. There probably won't be a lot of rain coming out of it. Looking ahead further to the seasonal rain outlook. So the chart on the left is November to January, the same idea of showing chance of exceeding median rain. And the contrast you'll see there with actually both of those charts, the one on the right is steps forward 1 more month, that's December to February, the classical summer. And you'll note the greeny blue colours for Eastern Australia, where there's a higher preference that the seasonal rainfall is likely to be above average for those parts of the world. And they're most likely going to be signals coming out of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. If those two things get cranked up as expected, then it does tend to historically push rainfall towards wetter conditions. Now, these model runs are running off what the observations are. So it's not a climatological run as such, it's what the weather and the global patterns look like at the moment. So they're expecting wetter conditions for the east. But if you look for Western Australia, the colours are all pretty bland, meaning the models have no preference to wetter or drier. Maybe a tiny bit wetter, but again, for the south, period of time when not a lot of rain happens anyway. And similarly, over summer, there's maybe a bit of a weak signal, but it's pretty weak. It's not really saying a lot. So that's been continuing a pattern for a lot of the growing season this year, where the climate models have been spread. Some have thought have been drier, some thought have been wetter, some have just had a neutral outlook. In contrast, last couple of years where we were getting fairly consistent guidance from the climate models, this year they haven't really been giving us a lot of consistent guidance, meaning that in most cases, decision making would rely on the short-term 1 to 2 weekly weather forecasts. So that's the story. So there's nothing much the models can tell us other than they think it's going to be a relatively normal summer. The other part of it, where they're often more confident in a sense, is with temperatures. And the chart on the left is November to January, chart on the right is December to February. And in this case, rather than just looking at the chance of exceeding median, this is looking at the likelihood of getting extreme temperatures. And by extreme temperatures, they mean seasonal temperatures in the top 20%. And the background colour is that if it's white, it's your normal chance of that happening. And as you go through the progressive red scales, it becomes progressively more enhanced over the background climate. So for the west, we have the Gascoyne-Murchison that has an elevated chance of hot conditions that runs down the west coast. But for a lot of the areas in the southeast, there's no particular signal there. Strong signal for Victoria coming from wet and Tasmania for wetter or for warmer conditions associated with that. You step forward into summer, west coast looks likely to be notably warmer than average, and smaller areas of the south. So that again probably comes as no surprise. The last few summers have been pretty warm, and so what these bring with it is the elevated risk of bushfires, for example, because crops have been harvested, there's stubble, there's that sort of stuff. So there's an elevated risk during that period of time. And it's this bit the models seem to have most confidence in, apart from rainfall. So just in summary, the summer rainfall before the start of 2025 was mixed. The first 3 months certainly had less rain in the north and more in the south. The first half of the growing season was notably drier than normal in many of the areas of the south. Complete contrast to the second half, which has finished really strongly. And that has been supporting good potential crop yields. The rain outlooks for the rest of 2025 are mostly neutral for WA, meaning they aren't telling us anything at all at the moment. So it's going to be the shorter term outlooks that will have greatest value. And consistently that's happening, this will come as no surprise. The summer is expected to be warmer than normal. And so at that point, I can hand over to Svetlana to carry on the next bit of the talk.
Thank you very much, Ian. So that means we're looking at a very wet summer coming, not a very wet summer, a very dry summer coming up. And I just thought, because we had expected that with the warmer weather conditions that we experienced this winter, that we would have a lot more springtime activity right now with native budworm, diamondback moth and aphids. So I thought I'd just bring you through to have a look at what's happening with those 3 main pests. Native budworm trapping began in June this year. We had an extensive trapping network. The black crosses indicate where the traps were located. These are pheromone traps, which were collected fortnightly by volunteers across the network, from agronomists to DPIRD staff to just some farmers who are very, very interested. So please contact the department if you are at all interested. And what we found was that when the first traps went out in June, we actually captured native budworm in those traps. So native budworm fly out of our agricultural regions during the spring, and they fly in sometime in the winter, in autumn and winter. We're finding that each year the budworm flights are earlier and earlier, which does indicate that their native food sources outside of the broadacre growing regions, even though we've had dry summers, it's been sufficient to keep them active and growing. So we got native budworm flights in June. If we just look at the traps from the pheromone traps, the darker the colour, the more moths were captured, the lighter the colour, the less. So if we go through to July, you can see that Geraldton area has had quite a lot more native budworm, and we're actually picking them up in the Central Ag region as well. And as we progress throughout the season, we do see that the moth flights in Geraldton in August did drop off, but we do get them being picked up in the Central, and as of last week, this is the trap catches. Our trap catches are able to be looked at by anybody. So if you just go to Moth Trap Viz, you can see what we've caught throughout the year and what we've captured in certain areas. Of interest is the fact that at Katanning last week, and this is one of my traps we've put in, I've just popped in the red dot to show that we caught 400 in the Katanning region. What it means is we do have a lot of moths in the area. What does it mean for you right now? Does it mean we've got lots of caterpillars? What those trap catches mean is that there's moth flight in our broadacre growing regions, and you do need to monitor for the caterpillars. Just because you have hundreds of moths in your trap, which has occurred at quite a few of my trial sites, it hasn't equated to a high number of caterpillars in the actual surrounding adjacent crop. What it means is the moths are in the landscape and you do need to monitor. Just remember that native budworm moths do prefer to lay their eggs on green plant material. However, we do have quite a lot of later sown crops in parts of the landscape. They're most at risk. The map here from PestFacts map just shows where growers and agronomists have been finding, and DPIRD staff have been finding caterpillars. Doesn't necessarily mean they're above threshold, but you do need to monitor. And unfortunately, as a crop senesces and dries off, native budworm, especially the larger caterpillars, can still be damaging. So you do need to actively monitor. And if you haven't found a native budworm, there is no need to spray. Spraying does not stop the moths coming in, but it definitely is good to only spray if you are at threshold, because we do still have other insects in the landscape, which the more times you spray do develop resistance. So let's try and keep that down. And unfortunately for monitoring, I have had quite a few agronomists asking if there's an easier way to do it. Unfortunately not. Sweep netting is the best way. And even if you are short or tall or small, if your sweep netting technique is right, like the net held at a 45-degree angle and in a good arc, you will still catch the native budworm in there, because I'm quite short and I have sweep netted with taller people, and we are pretty much on par with what we're catching. Just another reminder that when swathing occurs, that is considered to be harvest. So if you do have native budworm in the swaths, it's too late to do anything. The thresholds for native budworm, those developed by the department, are based on the total amount that a budworm will eat in its entire lifetime. The good news is that now there's an easier way to look at the thresholds. Crop Scout app has been developed with a native budworm application in there. So all you need to do is enter your counts per sweep net, and it will tell you whether you're at threshold or not and whether you need to spray or not. Otherwise, the department does have on its website a manual calculation you can do for sweep netting to determine the thresholds, and the thresholds are quite low depending on what commodity you've got. At the moment, with Ian's predictions, is going to be not a soft finish. It looks like we're not going to be getting any more rainfall. So what the soil moisture is all we've got. So we do expect that crops will be senescing by November, and we are already having harvest occurring in the Esperance port zone. If you do need to spray, bear in mind the withholding period, and we do need to bear in mind withholding periods and the time of harvest that you want. So maybe consider using some of the softer chemical options, or really making sure that you are monitoring your crops and maybe only spraying the hotspot if you absolutely have to. We have to admit that we're a bit surprised in the department about the fact that we've just had a warmer than average winter temperatures, and we have also been monitoring for diamondback moth using pheromone traps called the Delta trap, and the pheromone traps only capture the adult moths. We were expecting with the warmer than average season, even though we've come from a really dry summer from 24-25, that with warmer conditions, diamondback moth would actually increase. Our trapping program was out from June up until just recently, and you can just see with the coloured circles here, only Esperance really did we find a really good capture of diamondback moth. And if you'd actually looked at Ian's maps there, you'd have seen that Esperance did have a little bit of rainfall there. So that's what we're thinking is a bit of a green bridge. Those pheromone traps are adjacent to a crop that was also monitored for caterpillars. And if you actually look, on the left-hand side is the DBM moth counts, on the right-hand side is the number of larvae in 10 sweeps. If you actually look as the season progresses, you'll see that we do have low levels of DBM moths being captured throughout the landscape, but this didn't equate to DBM in our actual crop. And as we go into September, we're capturing quite high numbers of DBM. The good thing about DBM is that once a crop starts to senesce, the caterpillars don't do any damage, and we're looking at, even though we are getting really high DBM counts in some areas at the moment, the caterpillar numbers are very low, and these are unlikely to cause any damage. So I think from now on, you can stop monitoring for DBM, which was a bit surprising because we had really expected with a warmer winter conditions that we would see DBM activity. The other thing we were expecting with such a warm winter with what we've just had is that we were going to see lots and lots of spring aphid activity. To date, we had lots of reports of grown peach aphid present in crops from early in the season. These have peaked to high numbers in some areas, but crops are senescing, green peach aphid aren't a problem. We've had very few reports of cabbage aphid and turnip aphid in crops. And of the cereal aphids, there have been reports of them, but right now crops are out in head and senescing, so cereal aphids are unlikely to be an issue going forward in time. I had expected that even with the seed dressings that are used across the landscape, that we would have seen more aphid activity, which just shows that the weed control and the green bridge control has really been quite spot on across the landscape, because don't forget, the aphids can't survive in the absence of their host, so they need their host plant in the landscape to be able to survive. And the hot, dry summer really did cause a decrease in early aphid activity. We still got a few reports of Russian wheat aphid, mainly in the crops that hadn't had a seed dressing and were adjacent to areas with native grasses. So it just shows that the Russian wheat aphid is quite able to survive hot, dry summers. What we are getting reports of right now is, as people are sweep netting the crops, is do have a look to see what else is in the sweep net and what else you're seeing. There is some snail activity. Just because snails are being found in the canopy at this time doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a harvest contamination issue. It just means you need to budget to clean for snails. There is some budgeting calculators available from the Stellings to Coast website, which does show you what the cost will be. And snails really are only an issue in some parts of the port zone. However, if you are finding snails at harvest time, it does mean that there may be an issue next year, and you do need to budget for control measures next year. And talking about next year, now is really the best time to start looking to see what's out in the landscape right now, because what's there now will be there next year. So for instance, right now is a good time to be seeing black keel slugs, and as you're walking through the crop, also looking for conical snails. The slugs and the snails are able to survive hot, dry summers, and they're quite able to survive even when you think that it's been so hot and dry nothing can. They are very, very good at coming back, because both the black keel slug and the small conical snail have a burrowing habit and are very good at emerging in autumn when the opening rains occur. Bearing in mind that red-legged earth mites, hot, dry summers do not affect them, because the female red-legged earth mite is dying about now with diapause eggs inside her. Those eggs will hatch next year when the conditions are right. So if you're in the central or upper parts of our broadacre growing region, this has already occurred. If you're in the southern parts, we're still seeing red-legged earth mites out and about, especially in the lower canopy of plants. Take note, especially in those cereal crops that are going to be sown to canola next year, as you may need to look at seeding rates or control measures before your canola crop emerges. Now is also the time to start looking out for the weevils. So we have most of our weevil species have finished pupating and are in the adult stage, and they're very easy to find at this time of year. We've found that right now is when the weevils are most active, and come autumn, they can be very cryptic and hard to find, but if you found them last year, they will be there again next year. So all the pests you can see on these slides don't fly in. They are present in your paddocks year in, year out. And one thing that really needs to be noted is that in the northern parts of our landscape, we did get a lot of reports this year of native budworm causing damage to wheat, and it's not that the budworm has changed its habit, it's that the females laid the eggs on the radish, and as the radish was sprayed out, those caterpillars have then moved on to the wheat. So do also take note of where weeds are that have been missed in the landscape, as this will be a potential source for pests next year, and it's a really good time to start actively looking to stop the pests for 2026. And just a little reminder that the aphids and diamondback moths can't survive in our landscape without their hosts, so they will migrate as crops senesce. Native budworm migrates into our landscape, so it all comes down to, even last year's hot, dry summer still didn't stop those migrations. So the take-home messages for you is to, right now, you still can't stop monitoring for native budworm. We are still finding them in paddocks, and you do need to monitor. The only way to monitor is to use a sweep net and use the thresholds. If you see anything in those sweep nets, like snails, budget to clean the grain, and really plan for 2026 by looking for the pests right now in your region. And now I'm going to hand over to Geoff.
Thanks, Svet. I'm going to be talking briefly about some diseases that we've seen in 2025 and thinking about 2026. I guess every year we see a lot of the same diseases, but they come and go depending on what the variety spectrums are. And as Ian's talked about, what the season's given us in terms of the amount of rain when the rain happens. Now, this year, of course, we had, as Ian's already talked about, we had a relatively dry start, a bit of a late start, and that has probably contributed to some reduced infection or reduced severity of some things like net blotches. Once the rain got started, it really did get going, and we developed some good canopies, and it's continued on. So we've seen that the diseases, a number of diseases have started to develop, and have continued to be present through September, and indeed still being present and detected and active into October. Let's start with maybe the elephant in the room, the big ticket item. This year, probably the disease that our pathology teams probably had the most contact about has been barley scald. The reason for that is that we've always been worried about barley scald, and post the net blotch outbreaks in 2022, there's been some shift of varieties with good reason, and some of those varieties are susceptible to scald. What that's meant is a variety like La Perouse has been showing a significant amount of scald. What we've also seen is that in over the last year or so, the development of a new pathotype, a different pathotype of scald, that seems to have been impacting on varieties like Maximus and Spartacus. What we know is that scald is quite a diverse pathogen, so it does sort of develop or have multiple virulences that can occur. This year, what we've seen, probably developing slowly last year, but this year certainly what we've seen is that crops that we would hoped might show resistance for a while longer are expressing susceptibility. So you can see in the middle there, Neo with significant levels of disease, and that's been these photos are all from the lower grade southern region, but these levels of infection have been reported up and down the western half of the wheat belt. The Maximus infection has been all through the central wheat belt in the last couple of years, and the other one that we have noted, I don't have a photo here, but I know of a commercial trial in a paddock in the Great Southern of Xena with scald as well. So we've got quite a range of varieties that are affected. In fact, I think it's fair to accept that the majority of our varieties now could be susceptible. Not that they will be susceptible in all paddocks, because the pathotype affecting them may not be present, but there are pathotypes that have built up, that have occurred this year, that could render them susceptible. This is not a disaster. This is not something that's unexpected. What we know is that if you go and look at the NVT online website, that these varieties in Eastern Australia are all classed as susceptible. And so we are here in Western Australia, we're often a little protected by the land bridge between us. But yeah, we are literally just expressing what has happened in other parts of Australia. But I guess it's don't panic. We just need to understand what's happened in your region, in your crop this year, and respond in a way that's suitable to that. I will say that so that means if you didn't have scald this year, then you're going to be fine. If you did have scald in a crop this year and you're resowing that variety next year, you do need to be sure about your rotation, maybe thinking about if there's ways to reduce the stubble load, thinking about do you need to use a fungicide seed dressing, and planning in some fungicide thoughts, but ensuring that you're not going too early with that fungicide, which allows you to respond later. Remembering, of course, that scald really loves the sort of high rainfall or the rainy environment, and then that warming temperature. And Ian clearly indicated that we've had a wet and slightly warmer winter, perfect for a disease like scald. And it's whilst it's disappointing that we've seen these emergence of these new pathotypes. It's no surprise that it has taken off this year, and it is certainly something we're going to need to worry or think about when we plan for next year. Another new virulence. This talk isn't all about barley, sorry, it's just the first couple of barley slides. Another new virulence, or maybe this is a sort of a establishment, barley powdery mildew affecting varieties such as Maximus and Combat this year in the sort of Narrogin and down through Esperance regions. We actually saw this pathotype first in 2023 in Maximus. Didn't really see it last year, but this year it's been more widespread in its occurrence. I don't think it renders these varieties at the very susceptible to susceptible end, more that sort of moderately susceptible to susceptible, but it is a pathotype that can impact on these varieties, and so we need to be monitoring. Not something we can do over summer, but something that we need to keep in awareness for next year. Not something new, something that keeps on coming back to us, and that is loose smut. It was bad last year, and there's certainly been reports this year of some pretty bad crops. I would normally think of loose smut as a mildly impactful, more cosmetic disease in many occasions. But this year I have been made aware of some crops with quite high levels of infection, which is a worry. So the seasons and the have been favourable. Some of the varieties that we're growing, and certainly there has been concerns about varieties like Neo, Maximus, Rosalind that maybe are more susceptible to this disease. The picture you can see has the infected heads. This is at or just after when the transmission of infection will have occurred. So the spores are blown or off those infected heads onto the newly emerging heads, and that's the infection period. Now that's obviously favoured by moist conditions, and as I've talked about, and as Ian's talked about, during that heading period for barley, we've had some very favourable conditions. So the likelihood is that we're going to see good in terms of the disease, good transmission of disease into seed for next year. So if you had loose smut in your crop this year, the chances are you're going to be harvesting heavily infected seed, and that you're going to need to think about what you do with that. Is it harvesting from the least infected paddock? Is it trading grain with a neighbour who has uninfected paddock? And certainly it will be thinking about what is the best seed dressing to be using, and that most registered seed dressings are very effective, and there is certainly some highly effective seed dressings that are available. So this is one that I certainly think is something that we need to be aware of for next year, bearing in mind that this is a purely seed-borne disease. So the seed is the bit that you need to be worried about for delivery into next year's, for sowing of next year. Bacterial blight and oats. I'm not suggesting this is a major issue for everybody. The reason I put this up here is more of a diagnostic situation, in that we've had several questions this year about what this disease is. It's a bacterial disease, stripe blight, bacterial blight in oats, and it has been at a higher level than in some other seasons. Why is that? Well, twofold. One is that it is, primarily is because of the seasonal conditions and that beautiful rainfall that results in dense canopies. This is a bacterial disease splashed around or spread by contact. And so those wet, dense canopies staying wet for some period, perfect conditions for bacteria. Things to remember: it's not a fungus. Fungicides won't work. The sort of things that we need to understand is it's a stubble-borne and seed-borne disease that really, if you're in a heavily infected paddock, maybe you need to source some new seed, but that's probably not a major concern. The major consideration would be that if you're in a heavily infected paddock, that you spell that paddock from oats for a season to allow the stubble to break down. This one's not really anything new. This is yellow spot and Satorian or Staganospora nodorum blotch in wheat. These diseases are present in wheat every year. This year, it just seems that there's been a little bit more of them. Certainly early on in the year, there was a lot of questions about yellow spot in wheat, a lot of reports to PestFacts. And later in the year, there's been more reports about nodorum blotch and gloom blotch in wheat. Just the point I think here that I'm trying to make is that just to understand that the stubble from this year's crops, if you've had those diseases, could pose a greater risk than maybe we've been used to over the last few years, because these diseases, whilst present, have been at a relatively low level over the last few years. Probably the final disease I wanted to talk about just briefly is take-all in wheat. We've had several inquiries about these sort of whitehead patches in wheat. Is it crown rot? Has been the question. When we get plants, we see this beautiful black basal staining that is very diagnostic for take-all in wheat. It's a disease that's been present for a long time, but this year has seen a fairly high expression of the disease. So this is a disease for which there are several management approaches. Rotation is obviously important. There are some fungicide approaches as well, but rotation is the most important. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is the questions we were getting were, what is the cause of this? And this is an important thing to remember for any of our root disease issues, be that fungal root disease, be that Rhizoctonia, crown rot, take-all, or root lesion nematodes even. That correct diagnosis means that you're able to make the correct plan over the summer, because for the root diseases, you need to act before they're put in the ground. So knowing what your problem is really important in terms of managing these diseases in the next season. Carrying over inoculum into 2026, I'm not going to go into this a lot, but again, there's a number of ways in which inoculum can be carried over. Knowing your disease and knowing the method by which it's carried over means you can plan better. And do you need to rotate? Do you need to do some fungicide seed assessment dressings or get new seed? Do you need to rotate out of that paddock if it's a soil-borne disease? Certainly something like Sclerotinia seems to be present in the majority of paddocks these days. Ian's suggestion is it's going to be a warm and dry summer. That won't impact on these stubble, seed and soil-borne pathogens. Obviously, if there's no green bridge, then that'll delay the onset of some of these things that are mediated by the presence of green material at the start of the season. Just want to say, don't forget carryover from previous seasons. We grow big crops, stubbles are lasting longer. Last year we had high levels of flag smut in wheat, and so those paddocks from last year are going to be a risk if you sow wheat into them next year. You need to think about the variety or seed dressings. Okay, take-home messages. First one is, I think it's too late to be managing diseases in 2025. Yes, there's still diseases occurring. Late tillers in crops with powdery mildew, patches of Sclerotinia in crops. Yes, they're still happening. No, there doesn't seem to be any data that suggests that putting out a fungicide at this time of year is going to give you an economic return. So really, I think it's too late to be trying to manage disease this season for this season's crop. And finally, barley scald has emerged as a major risk now. Plan your seed dressing or your seed strategy for loose smut control. That hot, dry summer will maintain those stubble and soil inoculum. And I really want to make the point that we need to make sure that we're using all of our integrated disease management tools, rotation, variety, stubble management, all of those things, because we don't want to just rely on fungicide. I know they're cheap. I know we're better at applying them, but we need them to be the final piece of the puzzle rather than the thing we rely on. And on that, I'll pass over to Cindy.
Thank you, Geoff. Now, I just like to do this wasn't officially in the agenda, but I just wanted to make a brief mention of some of the tools and services that we offer as part of the PestFacts WA service. So all these insects and diseases that have been mentioned in the webinar, we have a great map called the PestFacts WA map that you can go and look at and choose to see what you would like to see. Like what has been reported to us since 1996 will be displayed basically on this map. So that's just a great tool that you can use. A nice visual representation of what's been out there. We also have a free app that is called the PestFacts WA Reporter app. If you're not sure what you are seeing in the paddock, please take a photo and request an ID. Or even if you just want to let us know, hey, I found this, that is so helpful for us because we can then alert. We can then know what's happening out in your area, and we can alert other people. We also have our PestFacts WA newsletter. We publish on Fridays as needed during the growing season, and we just alert our subscribers to what's happening. And we have some great articles talking about how to identify the pest or disease, how to manage it, and where to find more information. So if you haven't subscribed already, please feel free to go onto our website and subscribe for this free newsletter. And that brings us to the question and answer session of the webinar. So please feel free to use the chat or Q&A tool. And don't panic if you think of something after this webinar finishes. Feel free to email us at PestFacts and I'll forward that question to the appropriate presenter. So if I might just get my presenters to turn on the cameras, if that's okay, because I have seen, I'm going to start in the chat because I did see a question there. And Svet, if you want to unmute yourself, this question is several parts, so I might go one part at a time if that's okay. It's an insect related. Congratulations for the nice presentation. And it's from Dr. Satya Taddy, an entomologist from India. Welcome. What about the correlation between pest damage and temperature?
So that's something I didn't mention, thank you, Satya, is that the warmer the temperatures are, the quicker the life cycle for all of our caterpillar and aphid pests, and it's true for all insects really. So the warmer the temperature, the more the pests increase. That doesn't necessarily lead to increased crop damage, as it depends on the crop stage and how well the crop is outgrowing the damage. Now this year we had low levels of green peach aphid throughout our trials and really throughout the landscape. I was expecting their numbers to peak, but what we have had is fungus and other predator activity causing population crashes, and the populations have built up too late to cause crop damage. That's green peach aphid in canola. The leaves of the nest, and they're really not going to cause any damage. However, the warmer conditions and what I probably didn't mention is turnip and cabbage aphid, if they are present on crops that aren't senescing in a later crop, look, the warmer temperatures will cause them to increase in size, and you really do need to monitor the colony length. But once crops have senesced, they do tend to fly off and move away. With regards to native budworm, yes, we have eggs in the landscape. The warmer the temperatures, the quicker the life cycle for budworm will definitely be occurring, and the larger the budworm, the more damage they can do. So you do need to monitor and look for budworm.
And that's great timing because the second question is about budworm. What are the cultural practices for managing budworm?
This is a difficult one because there's no tillage in our landscape. So realistically, the practical management for budworm in a crop situation, apart from monitoring and spraying and using a spray that is not going to impact the beneficials. So we do get a lot of predator activity on budworm, which can mop up after a spray event. So we don't really have any cultural practices per se that will control budworm in a crop, apart from growing crops in areas where you do have lots of budworm activity, you can grow crops that aren't susceptible to budworm. And controlling weeds, I guess, is a big one. Control the weeds in your crops, because that's what the budworm will preferentially lay their eggs on, especially your radishes.
Thank you, Svet. Sorry for interrupting at the end there. The third question for you, are you doing any artificial infestation to identify host plant resistance to aphids?
The short answer is no. Lupins did once upon a time, yes, stop raising your eyes there, Geoff, did have a resistance rating. But these days, the plant breeders are not looking at plant resistance to aphids, but it is something that hopefully as researchers we can push.
Great, thanks very much for that, Svet. And now we have a question for Geoff. So Geoff, if you'd like to unmute your microphone. Does soil amelioration or burial have an impact on the carryover of some diseases such as sclerotinia?
So basically what we're talking about is moving that inoculum from the surface of the soil or near the surface of the soil and burying it deeper under the soil. So yes, that's likely to reduce the amount of, well, in terms of if we're talking about stubble-borne diseases, I know we said sclerotinia, but if we're talking about stubble-borne diseases, if we move that stubble below the ground, then the spores aren't able to escape, and so that makes a significant difference. If we're talking about sclerotes, we're burying them deeper. Depending on how deep they're being buried, there will be varying degrees in terms of the impact. But yes, it will remove them from being able to contribute, I guess, to the spore load in a given season. Now, the issue with sclerotia might be that if we do some amelioration within a short period again, we might even bring them back up. But yes, it will impact on the inoculum load and therefore the disease pressure.
Thank you very much for that, Geoff. And that brings us on to Ian. There's a climate question for you. So if you want to unmute your microphone. Does the summer seasonal outlook take into account the possibility of rainfall from tropical cyclones, or are they too unpredictable?
Thanks for the question. In one point of view, when they do the seasonal runs, for example, they'll have it with global pictures at the moment. That is, they'll have global patterns of temperature, humidity, wind, rainfall, these sorts of things. And they run the climate model forward for 3 months, but they won't do it one time. They might do it 50 times or 30 times. So they get an ensemble of runs. But the issue with that is that the tropical cyclone, in a sense, has a life cycle of 1 to 2 weeks tops. The predictability is, let's say, maybe a week away, maybe 2 weeks. So if you're sitting at the moment now, nobody can tell you whether there'll be 1 cyclone, 2 cyclones or 10 cyclones. But when they might occur, that's just outside of the range of the seasonal models at this stage. But what they do with the ensemble of runs, there will be a whole set of weather sequences simulated. So there'll be, let's say, quasi-cyclones are created, depends upon the resolution of the model. So if for example, you have a particular sea surface pattern where there's a lot of warmth over the eastern Indian Ocean between the northwest shelf, the conditions within the models that might make it likely for a cyclone of some sort to develop will simply be triggered more often. So from one point of view, they do pick up that sort of thing. So if you had a prediction for a really, really wet season, a lot of it might be coming from just convectional, the diurnal thunderstorms. That is probably the mainstay of it. But they probably will be throwing some of the tropical cyclones up within it. But the point is, it'll be highly variable between runs. And so this is why they've got to do an ensemble run, because nobody really knows how the climate's going to evolve from this point. It certainly won't follow any one path. It's really a range of possibilities. And so, yes, they do simulate cyclones if they have small enough spatial resolution, but you can't say, like if there'll be an early cyclone in November or something, you just can't say at this stage. You can infer it from historical records, looking, related back to sea surface temperatures and what happened in the past. So that's the basis of some of the seasonal outlooks, whether we think there'll be a lot or a few. But they they will occur within the model run. So in a sense, they do pick it up. But in terms of whether you'll get a lot or a little, that's still just contained within ensemble of runs, I'm afraid.
Great. Thanks very much, Ian. And Satya has commented mainly for Svet that she's looking for research opportunities in IPM and entomology, which is fantastic. And yes, and thank you very much, Satya, for your comments and questions. It's fantastic. And I think that I cannot see any further questions in the chat or the Q&A, but again, feel free to email us at PestFacts if you think of one later. The webinar recording will be on our DPIRD YouTube channel in the near future, and feel free to keep an eye out for us on X or / formerly Twitter, because we are regularly posting alerts and information there. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. I'd like to say a very big thank you to all the participants that have joined us today for just being here, for your questions and your comments. And I'd like to say a very big thank you to my presenters Ian, Svet and Geoff for presenting today and sharing their wisdom with us. And I'd like to say a very big thank you to my co-host Jeanette Pratt, who's been working behind the scenes for us. And so we'll say goodbye for now, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day. Okay. Bye, everyone.